about a messy one that I encountered when I was just a little girl. And because we've been looking at some of the folks around Jesus that he went to, or came to him, whose lives had become, as we say in any anonymous group, unmanageable. The first step in any anonymous group, if you don't know this, is that if you're going to get better, you have to admit that your life has become unmanageable. And so some of these messy ones that were around Jesus were in very unmanageable lives. And so when I was a little girl, I met one that at the time I didn't know was what we would classify as a messy one. I was just frightened to death of him. His name was Vince. And Vince lived on the streets of a little town in Iowa. And that was the town that my family would go to on Saturday. You don't do that here in the Chicagoland area, I have figured out, because everything is so close. But when you live in the country, there is a ritual that you go through on a weekly basis called going to town. Anybody know going to town? Anybody know about going to town? Because when you live in the country, things aren't close. So you go to town. You go to town to get your groceries. You go to town to go to the doctor. You go to town to go to the movie. You go to town to do anything like going to Kmart or Walmart or anything like that. You have to go to town to do that. Now, in the little town that I grew up, there was a grocery store. But when you wanted to get really good, cheap prices, you had to go to town to get that, because a small town grocery store couldn't quite handle the 99 cents a pound hamburger it was back in those days, remember? And so every time that we would go to town, which was usually on a Saturday, my mother loved to go to town on a Saturday, she also wanted to go with what my family affectionately called, she wanted to go to the Army store, which was, for all intents and purposes, the Salvation Army store. Now, Salvation Army does good work, but I wouldn't go to one of their stores now because of some of their policies, right? But when I was a little girl, I didn't know anything about that, so I loved going to the Salvation Army store with my mother, except for the days that Vince would be hanging around the Salvation Army store. Because what I didn't know at that time, I know after the fact, but what I didn't know at that time was that there was something mentally wrong with Vince. And I'm going to tell you, I'll be very, very honest, that one of the reasons why I didn't know that there was something mentally wrong with Vince is because in our home life, we were living with someone who was extremely mentally ill, and we did not know that. My oldest sister was a borderline personality disorder, and that causes all kinds of problems in a family system, and you start to get used to things being the way that they are. And so when I realized that I was more frightened of Vince than I was my older sister, I just thought that he was like demon possessed. Because when I was growing up, our church taught demon possession, that could happen to you, and it meant demon, not something like physical malady or mental malady. And Vince was dirty, of course. Vince had, like shaggy beard and shaggy hair and all of that sort of stuff. And Vince could be walking along, and then all of a sudden, he would just flip like this and scream at you. And he didn't scream nice things at you. He would scream like really bad cuss words that I wasn't supposed to be using at that age, but when I was away from my mother, I used all the time, right? I still do. Not when I'm around my mother, though. Not when I'm around my mother. Vince would scream and holler at people, and Vince would fling himself against the walls of the Salvation Army. And what I did as a child, I began to equate Vince, to even be able to feel comfortable. What I began to do was I began to equate Vince with that character in Mork and Mindy called Exodore. Does anybody remember that character, Exodore? And Exodore would flip around and he'd say, "We can't all get through this aisle," and there wouldn't be anybody near him. So I had to start calling Vince Exodore in my mind to feel safe. You see, I was so unnerved and I was so upset by the behavior that I saw in Vince whenever we were in town and he was out walking the streets, that in my mind I started to make fun of him. Oftentimes things that we don't understand, we make fun of them in a way to make it easier for us to cope with what we're seeing in front of us. What I know today is that Vince probably had a very severe case of Tourette's syndrome. Because Vince could not control his behavior. He had not only speech tics where he would scream out and he would use cuss words and stuff like that. He had physical tics, the flinging himself against the wall, or tics where he couldn't stand still for a very long period of time. He had Tourette's syndrome probably. And the problem is that no one wanted to help Vince at all. You would always see Vince walking the streets. You would always see Vince sitting, holding himself. He would sit next to a parking meter, and he would hold on to that parking meter as hard as he could, and he would just scream and scream and cuss and scream and cuss, holding on to that parking meter, you know? And what I learned as a child was, stay away from him. Now, granted, a mother doesn't know in that sort of situation what's happening, and so her first line is to protect her child. But my mother would say, stay away from him, because we didn't know what was going on. We just knew he was messy. We just knew that there was so much chaos and messiness around that one, that what my sister was doing in our home, screaming and hollering, seemed like nothing compared to that. And I wanted to talk today about what we call messiness, mental illness sorts of issues when we talk in this sermon series about messiness, because it is still the biggest taboo in the church. I'm sure that we don't think it is, but it is the biggest taboo in the church. People don't want to talk about people who have mental illness, that are dealing with mental illnesses. And in fact, this story in the lectionary only comes up once in 3 years. That's how much we put it on the back burner when we're learning about this one who, very much like Vince, was unable to control his behavior because he had some kinds of something going wrong in the mind that didn't connect him in a way that he could talk or he could speak or he could act in what we call normal, but now we have found out is probably not any more normal than anything else, right? The church has historically not been welcoming and open to those who have mental illness. In fact, when folks come through the door and we perceive something in our gut says to us, there's something mentally wrong with this person, people that have never changed their pew for 25 years might sit someplace else. I'm serious. If someone who they think has mental illness comes and sits near them, it's such a taboo, and yet it is so prevalent in our society. Sandy always prays for those who are without homes. Do you know the percentage of folks who are living on the street who have mental illness? 46%. 46% of the people who are living on the street that we walk by, or that we take a wide swath around, or that we totally ignore because we think they're messy, are living with demons that we don't want to talk about. We don't want to touch. We don't want to be near them. I want to share some other statistics with you today because it's frightening and it's shocking. So let's see, how many? There's a pew right here of 4 folks. According to the latest statistics that they have, one of those folks in that pew would be suffering with a mental illness in any given year. And we may or may not know it, because that kind of messiness we want to put blinders on too. 1 in 25 adults in the U.S., that means 9.8 million people, suffer serious mental illness in a given year that substantially interferes with or limits one or more of their major life activities. 1 in 5 youth from the ages of 13 to 18 experiences a severe mental disorder at some point during their life. For children ages 8 to 15, the estimate is 13% of those folks. 1.1% of adults in the United States live with schizophrenia. 2.6% of adults in the United States live with bipolar disorder. 6.9% of adults in the U.S., 16 million people, have at least one major depressive episode in the past year, not in their lifetime, once a year. Now listen to Illinois. This is just Illinois. I would tell you that when it comes to folks being plagued with mental illness, Illinois ranks pretty high in the least amounts. Illinois is 11th on the ranking of folks having mental illness. But when it comes to access to care for those who do have mental illness in the state of Illinois, it drops to 22%. So in other words, we limit the access to health care for those folks who have mental illness, and it doubles. Our percentage doubles when we limit that. So as of 2015, these are the best statistics I could get, 10.4% of all Illinoisans live with a serious psychiatric disorder. 6% have major depression, 2.6% have bipolar, 1.1% have schizophrenia, and 3.5%, which is the highest growing percent, suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder used to just be seen as somebody had a case of the nerves. Now we know that post-traumatic stress disorder is a debilitating illness that can cause people to completely be non-functioning in their lives. But here's the really scary statistics in the state of Illinois, and this is listed as mental disorder. 21.4% of all Illinoisans suffer with a substance abuse problem. That's more than those who suffer with a serious psychiatric problem. And here's the really scary statistic. 15% of all Illinoisans suffer with alcoholism, and it is legal to get our hands on alcohol. We want always to say, oh, those people with those illicit drugs, they're so bad, they're so awful, there's something wrong with them. Only 10.6% of all Illinoisans suffer with illicit drug problems. 3.5% of people suffer with prescription drug problems. So you see, the drug that we can get legally is the one that's causing us the most problems. We can get our hands at the age of 21 onto as much alcohol as we want to get our hands on. And 15% of our state's population can't handle it. It causes them to have a mental disorder. As I said before, the church has historically, for centuries, not dealt with talking about what our responsibilities are with folks who are suffering with diseases of the mind. They're frightening, aren't they? They're scary. We don't want that messiness. That's an easy one to walk away from, because you know why? Because we say, they're crazy. I ain't doing that crazy, you know? And in fact, it has still been a problem of making fun of mental illness in our lives. One of the most popular memes going around today on our social media is, not my monkeys, not my circus, not my mess. Do you see? We're so frightened by those who have problems with their mind. In fact, we even sometimes get angry with folks who have problems with their mind. I'm going to tell you, the angriest person I ever was with was my sister, who had the borderline personality disorder. I was so angry at her most of my life that I did her funeral without shedding a tear, because I had absolutely no connection. I was so frightened by what her mess was. The church has not done right by those who suffer with pain in the mind. The church has left them behind, focusing only on those who can do it the way we want, who will sit the way we want them to, who will not talk the way we don't want them to talk, who will be nice the way we want them to be nice. And yet right here in this pew, one of those people that we love so very much might be suffering, and we won't even know it because we won't ask, because that's too messy. I love this story of the Gerasene demoniac when he says, "My name is Legion." And Jesus says to him, "Come, tell me, talk to me, what do you need?" You see, he has lost his identity in the midst of that illness. Like many times, folks who are suffering from mental illnesses get lost in that illness. They lose their identity and they don't remember that they are children of God too. But what Jesus does is he walks forward and he says, "Come, I'm going to help you. I will help you get through this." And while we know today in the 21st century that that story is a representative story, we don't have a healer walking around saying, "Poof, you're healed," like Jesus did in the story. We also know in the 21st century that if we don't start taking this particular messiness seriously enough, that it will only get worse. We can't go outside and say, "Poof, you're healed." But we can say, "Our doors are open. Come in and sit by me." Again, I want to stress that I'm not talking about not having boundaries. I'm talking about the difference between having boundaries and outright rejection. I'm talking about the difference between being welcoming and shutting the door. And what Christians today can do is we can say we're going to fight for these folks as much as we would fight for anyone in this world. We can say we are going to challenge it when they say we're not going to have any more mental health funding for our government. We can challenge it when they start closing facilities because they cost too much money. We can stand up and say this person's worth is as much as my worth. We can sit with the person who's so distressed that the only thing they can think about doing is taking their own life. We can go and be with the person who can't stop bringing the bottle to their lips. We can offer love in a place where we have historically, and I would even say notoriously, rescinded the offer of love. This is a big challenge for us. It's a huge challenge for us to look ourselves in the mirror and say, have I cut out someone who is a child of God simply because they're depressed? We don't like to be around depressed people. They bring us down, right? Have I cut out someone because they're struggling with something that I can't understand? You see, the glory of it is that we don't always have to understand it. The glory of it is that we can just be present like Christ was. We can just sit with the person and listen. We can offer the hand to hold. We can rub the shoulders. We can wipe the tears, which is what the scripture tells us to do anyway, right? All of that healing we can do. But we have to let go of the fact that the church has turned a blind eye to the messiness of mental illness. So my challenge, I will be very honest with you, my challenge is always to be in repentance for the way that I treated my sister. I don't know that I would do anything different because I am still frightened by what someone who's been diagnosed with that can do in this world, the violence of it. But what I can do is the next time is not be so rigid, is not be so easy to shut the door, is to be a person who will offer love rather than offer judgment. All of our challenges, you see, all of us are challenged to be really honest with ourselves and ask ourselves, how many times a day do we say about another person, that person is driving me nuts? That is defaming to folks who have mental illness. How many times a day do we say, and Lynn will tell you, I say this quite often, I am going crazy. I need to knock this off. That is defaming to the people who suffer from an illness of the mind. How many times a day do we walk the other direction if we see that messiness in front of us? Those things challenge us about just how well we are living out the call to be the people of Christ in this world. And I fail quite regularly at that. Perhaps maybe you do too. Perhaps maybe this is one of the messy areas where you yourself need some work. Perhaps this is the messiness that will always be our challenge until we decide to be like Jesus and cross the river that divides us from those who suffer with brain disorders and reach out a hand of help. You see, if there's nothing else that this story from the Gerasene demoniac teaches us today, it is this, is that Jesus was here and he was there, and Jesus didn't ask him to come over where Jesus was. Jesus got in the boat and went to him. Maybe we need to cross some bridges. Maybe we need to cross some water. Maybe we need to get in the boat, in our cars, whatever, and help like Jesus would. Amen. We come now to the time in our worship service when we have the opportunity to return a portion of the gifts that God gives to us so freely. As the ushers wait upon us, if you would take these pew pads that are located on the inside aisles, sign in, let us know if